Hello, everyone. Welcome to TruthWorks. I'm Bob Sutton. I'm guest hosting in place of Patty McCord. Jessica has let me do it. And today's guest is my friend Beth Steinberg, who, if I introduced her and described all the different places she had worked in HR, been a chief people officer, that's all we would talk about for the remainder of it. The first time I heard Beth's name was this would have been 2006,
yeah.
when I was working with a guy named Chris Cox, who was a 24-year-old chief people officer at a company called Facebook, and Beth had just left. But I met her in person just a few years ago, and we've been hanging out ever since, when she was chief people officer at Chime. And Beth, maybe you should just start out just to warm us up, because like Jessica, like you've had like real jobs, unlike me, I'm just an academic.
Yes.
And just maybe you could just describe maybe your favorite job in people or HR and what you learned from it. And then Jessica can jump in, because she actually understands how these jobs work and what it feels like. So what's your favorite job? Yeah, unfortunately and fortunately. So what was kind of your favorite job and lesson from it? Since we had like 20 of them or something.
Yeah,
if we had them all
that's
up.
a good question, and thank you for having me here, Bob and Jessica.
Thank you for joining us.
I have worked at a lot of companies, both sort of larger Fortune 500 companies, but my real love is startups and scaling emerging companies. And I would say I've had a lot of great jobs, but I think I was at a company called Sunrun, which is a solar startup, which is still around, but I think I was like employee 75 or something when it was really scaling. And it was hard, but I think there was so much joy in the work, because it was the first company that I worked at that was like 100% mission driven, because residential solar really wasn't a thing. And not only were people very motivated by working at a mission driven company because of climate and all of that, but they were also disrupting a very stodgy, energy industry that needed disruption. And so it was just really exciting. Even in the hard times, you had all these amazing people that, you could rely on. And to this day, there's a huge group of Sunrun alum that are just super, super close. And I have found for myself that I do best in disruptive companies.
I like that.
You're working in one right now, right?
I am. Yeah, I'm doing a bunch of different things right now, but yes, I am doing some stuff for one of the companies at under X at Alphabet, a company called Tapestry that is also disrupting, the energy space and the energy grid. And I actually got there through people at Sunrun, because we stayed connected for so much of this time.
Yeah.
And that was 2011, 2012. It was a long time ago.
Well, that's why you got to keep your connections close,
Totally.
You never know what's going to lead. So Beth, your story's so fascinating. So you grew up through the people world, right?
Yeah, by accident though. It was never my intent, Yes, I think now people go to school, for it, but I sort of fell into it. They did. I'm too old. It did not exist at the time. So I fell into it by accident. And then, yes, grew through it, sort of feeling like, boy, this is a place where I can actually add value to a company by helping people be better. And that was, that was and is, in its truest form, very, very appealing to me.
Beth, did you start at Nordstrom? Do I remember this?
I did. Nordstrom was the first company that I ever worked at. I think it's the first job I ever had. And I did stuff during grad school for Nordstrom. And then I always wanted to be a clinical psychologist. But then when I was in school to be a clinical psychologist, I realized I don't want to be a clinical psychologist. and Nordstrom was opening up the Midwest region and asked me to go be in HR. I'd never done that before. So I decided to go and leave San Diego, California, and move to Chicago, Illinois, and subsequently opened many of the stores in the Midwest for Nordstrom, probably hiring and training like in excess of 10,000 employees. So that was really kind of trial by fire into my first HR job.
Well, yeah, and list some of the companies that you've worked for, because I don't think our listeners, know.
Yeah.
You've worked for some impressive companies.
Yeah, some good ones. So Nike, EA. EA was really my first, I think, big job. A lot of good HR people came from EA and worked under both Rusty Roof and Gabrielle Toledano, who, Gabby's just phenomenal and was an amazing leader. And then, mostly startups. So I was at Sunrun, as I mentioned. I was at Meta, Facebook in the early days when it was quite chaotic, kind of a crazy place. I was at a company, BrightRoll, that got acquired by Yahoo. I was lastly at Chime, where I was the chief people officer for many years. And then I've done some other kind of, novel things, like I worked at a venture capital firm doing, people stuff. So I have been very fortunate to have worked for some really terrific companies.
And I will say that having met the folks at Chime, especially, people love working for Beth too. Her team just loved her. They really did.
As I them.
Well, we were talking before we started recording about I think you said a friend of yours said if you take another chief people officer role that, what were their words?
Well, he said to me, "I will really think you're stupid if you take another chief people officer role." And he, it's in all seriousness, it's just a really, really tough job.
Yeah.
I think it always was, but sort of during COVID, that time frame, it became even, I think, more difficult. And it continues to be difficult as sort of, the employee, pro-employee companies turn to like non-pro-employee companies. You see these shifts and leaders have to adapt to them. And then, Jessica, I'm sure, you know this, not always is this role respected in the same way. Now, I've been quite lucky that I have not found that so much for myself. I think part of it because I just wouldn't let that happen. I wouldn't get into my head that this is not, an important role. So I think it's just a really tough role.
Yeah, no, Laszlo was on a bit ago, and we started talking about there's like one headwind with this role, and it's not that it's not strategic or it's not important or whatever, but everybody thinks that they can do it, right? Like
they do.
Yeah,
they do.
Like it's different than being the chief product officer. It's different than being the CFO. Like the organization doesn't question those executives the way that they question this one. And then to your point, over the last few years, everything that has been piled into this role, whether it's you're the chief medical officer, you're the chief diversity officer, now you're the AI strategist, and you are also the HR strategist in the normal job, but you have all these other roles as well. So I think it is just very complex, and
it is.
Unless you've been in it, like we have, it's really hard to understand that complexity to a full degree.
I agree. And I think, Bob, you maybe said this to me, years ago, that this role, in certain ways has become the pain sponge for the organization. And
I think you said it to me, but that's okay.
Maybe, I don't know. But it is true. And I think, that's hard. That's a big burden to bear, and I think sort of the balancing of, I always viewed my job as, my role is to drive business objectives through people, right? That's my role. And I think you're sort of like damned if you do and damned if you don't. If you care too much about people, why are you doing that? If somebody is upset about something and you didn't address it exactly how, you were supposed to, why didn't you do that, right? So you're really sort of caught in the middle. And I coach a few more junior chief people officers right now. And what I, have said to them is, your job, and I got a lot of this from Patty, your job is not to make people happy. That is not your job. That's an impossible proposition. Your job is to try to create the conditions for high performance inside your company. That's how I view the job. It's much more complicated than it seems.
Yes, I was talking to another chief people officer, and I was like, just get used to making people unhappy.
That's right.
Like that.
That's right.
It
is true.
And it's like, and some days you'll just be surprised they'll be happy with you, and take it and put it in your pocket and save it for later, because it's a really rare thing.
Exactly.
But
exactly.
And the amount of stuff that you just have to let roll off of your back.
No doubt.
And it's like,
I wasn't always good at that either. I have to say.
I think to grow into that.
Yeah, I think as I, matured, I realized, not every problem I can solve, not every problem I should try to solve. I can't beat myself up about that all the time, thinking I could have done better, I should have done more, which is probably a lot of women probably do that anyway. But you have to. It's hard because you have to feel very close and personal for employees. I believe you need to have that relationship, but you also have to have a thick skin and depersonalize a lot of things to sort of like get through the day, quite frankly.
So I want to ask maybe both of you a question. We can start with Beth. Both of you, well, you have experience with a lot of different CEOs. So part of your job, from talking to both of you, especially Beth, I've talked to about this, is knowing when to push back against the CEO and knowing when, well, I might not agree with it, but I got to do it anyway. So how do you deal with that? And how do you advise your mentees to deal with that?
It's a great question.
It's a great question. And, I don't know that I have a perfect answer for that. I have and always have had what I feel in my head is a line that cannot be crossed. And that's around anything unethical. I just won't cross that line. So to the extent that anything unethical in my mind was happening, I felt like I'll take the lumps. I have to address this. This is my job. Not everybody is going to have the cojones to say this to a senior leader, but that's sort of like what I signed up for. But you disagree with people around you all the time, I found, on little things like maybe small hiring decisions, not big ones, maybe a way that a culture, a CEO wants a culture to be viewed versus some things you want. Like I stopped taking, I felt like I stopped being so precious, to be honest. Like, so what? I don't agree. I think we're probably making a mistake. Maybe there'll be consequences, but like, I have to just let this go. So I sort of had a rubric in my head around it. Now, I definitely also feel like, and Jessica, I don't know if you felt this way too, but I do feel like sometimes this role is the only role that tells the CEO and other people the truth. And as hard as that is, I would say I probably suffered consequences for that. And I probably got accolades for that too. I did take that seriously. And I do think this is a role that demands a very courageous leader.
Yeah, no, it's not for the faint of heart. That's for sure.
It is
and,
not.
I think I have a similar rubric, and for me, it was like, you got to pick the hill you want to die on.
For sure.
It's got to be the thing that's going to move the needle, that be the most important. And those are the ones. And of course, anything on the ethical side, you're always going to fight for that. But then there's some big moments for the company where they're just wrong, or they're not seeing it. And, or it's just like shit they don't care about, but it's really important. And you are the one that's showing the mirror to them of the role that they play in it. And they just sometimes don't want to hear that. And you do take lumps for that, because you're like,
you do.
And you'll be with them after a meeting, and you'll be reiterating what people are getting from the meeting. They're like, but that's not what I said. And you're like, I know that's not what you said, but that's what they heard. Okay. People they heard this. And then they get so mad because you're the bearer of that news.
Exactly.
And so you're sort of, because you're the bearer of the news, you get blamed for it. But I'm also a big believer that, I don't know, Beth, you probably built your own art around this, but if I got them to think it was their idea.
Oh, I 100% agree. Oh, no doubt. No doubt.
So good.
No doubt.
And so that was a big strategy of mine.
I agree.
Like, how do I get them to think this is their idea? Because if they think it's their idea, they'll want to do it. If I tell them to do it, they won't want to do it.
Totally. It's so funny because I would know, I won't say what company, but a recent company, I would know that I was actually getting through when someone would say, blah, 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 use these words, which he never would have normally used those words. Those are words you say. And I'm like, excellent. I love it.
Perfect.
That's exactly what I want to happen. Right.
And that's when you know your work is happening.
Exactly. Well, and I also think, I sort of changed my ire in many ways against leaders, thinking like, why are they doing this? They don't know, what are they doing? I realized that, I'm of an age where a lot of leaders worked at GE and learned how to be a leader, or worked at Procter and Gamble and learned how to be a leader, or HP or whatever. You learned how to lead people. You learned the importance of culture. Now you have a good idea. You're the CEO. And I now have a lot of empathy, especially for a lot of the, younger leaders that I work with. Like, how do you know these things? There's no way you would. And so what I look for now when I look for a leader is, do they have self-awareness, and do they have curiosity? If you have that and you know nothing, I can work with you, right? Because you want to learn, you want to get better, and you're willing to actually hear some things about yourself. And, it's just hard to learn how to be a good leader unless you're put into the deep end and you have to figure it out.
So that's actually a great point, because when I think of, since I've been in Silicon Valley for 40 years, when I first got here, you even could map all of the companies that just came out of HP. It was like literally hundreds of people, hundreds of companies.
Yeah.
Somebody, John Freeman at UC Berkeley had an old unpublished study where he showed all, and as we know at HP in the old way, what would they do? They'd hire you as an engineer, and they were usually men in those days, and there's some exceptions, and then they'd give you one employee, and they'd see if you screwed it up, and they'd train you too, and if you didn't screw it up, they'd give you a bigger team, and eventually you'd be running a division. Or a business, and at some point they get an idea and spin out and start a company. But that process, it might happen at Google a little bit now, but it's pretty rare. Like you say, it tends to be young founders who have an idea, and boom, they've got $100 million or more. Exactly. They've got a company.
Yeah, exactly. And they're often not held accountable or asked by the board about any of this people stuff. Now, I think a lot of them intuitively understand this stuff is important, right? They're, knowledge, you employ knowledge workers. They are your product. And so you have to understand, making them work together better and make them is going to drive better outcomes. But how you get that done, they have no idea. And how would they?
Right. How would they?
Well, I have a question, since both of you have dealt with this, and this is a modern question, which is that even more than in the past, I see employers looking for the solo superstars they want to hire. You can just see what just happened with Meta with these huge amounts they're paying for AI people. So what's your take about when you go after the stars and after you get them, what you do with them?
That's a great question.
It is a great question. I mean, I have always been somewhat skeptical of the star model, Jim Barron's old study that went on for a long time. I mean, I think because there are the talent density with AI and ML engineers, I understand the strategy that they're doing. So I think sometimes you do have to do that. And I do think you can really, if you get the right couple of right technical talent, you can attract a lot more people. So I do understand doing that. What you do when you get them in, I think you have to really try to understand what motivates them and what's going to make them happy. I mean, I'm a firm believer that, no one's going to turn down money, but I think most great people are not in it just for the money. They really want to do something magical. Most of the really talented engineers that I know, which I'm lucky to know a lot of them, they really want to make a difference. If their product's not being used to actually do something great, they are not satisfied. So I really think you have to figure out what motivates them and give them the ability to, create something that is going to, be a game changer in their career.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And I mean, look, like if you want the best engineering talent in AI, you have to be competitive from a comp perspective.
You do.
Like you do. But that a star to me, isn't somebody that you just pay a high price for. A star is, maybe you pay a high price for them, but they have the qualities that Beth is talking about. Like they're driven and passionate and drooling to do what you're working on. Right. And they are coming with a niche skill set that nobody else has. And so of course you're going to pay a premium for that person. But when you get them in, I think what a lot of organizations don't do well is they don't zone in on the passion and the drive as much as they should. Yeah. And then when they get them there, a lot of these stars, they make it hard for them to do what they're there to do. Right.
Exactly.
And we at Netflix, we always believe like, let's hire the best, but get out of their way. Right.
Exactly.
Let them do the work. That's what they came to do. Right. So I think, how to treat a star, if you actually have one, and a real star, again, isn't just somebody that makes a lot of money. They're actually talented and passionate and driven about what you're trying to solve. And then give them the runway to do it.
So Jessica, there was another thing, at least in the famous Netflix deck, I'd like you to comment on here, because the definition, my understanding of the famous Netflix deck, which I guess that maybe you were involved in writing that too, but I know that Patty and Reed especially were. But so you would define a star not just as somebody who's great at their job, but somebody who helps other people around them succeed too, isn't that?
Yeah, I mean, they had to be great not only at their craft, right? But they had to be great also at the culture, which was they had to be selfless. They had to, not be an asshole. And, and the list goes on and on. But you were not great just because you were good at a craft, right? You had to be the full, you had to be the full package.
I see some less of that emphasis sometimes now around, kind of putting up with things from really talented people. And, when I try to coach companies that I work with on, once you do it, you're sort of ruining everything. Because once you say, okay, this is our culture, this is how, we reward, this is what we expect of you. Oh, but we don't of this person. What are you saying? I mean, one of my biggest pet peeves of corporate America is hypocrisy. And I just see it all the time, and it slowly dilutes the culture.
Yep.
And when the culture gets diluted, the work is not as good. Again, this is not about, I have a Pollyannic view of work. I don't. I'm very pragmatic, but I know that you set things up in a company to get outcomes. Right? Yeah. You don't do it to be nice. Maybe you're nice and you're a nice person. I am, and I care about people greatly. But the things that I've always done in companies are to get better output. And my belief is if you build trust, if they feel you care about them, if you're clear about expectations, if their work is connected to something larger than themselves and they understand how they fit in, you are going to get better work, right? And so I think the danger right now is, getting stars that maybe are not as aligned to the culture and behaviors that you want them to be. And that eventually will cause damage.
Yeah. I'm so glad that you said that, because it's the exact same thing that I preach, is that your employees are just waiting and watching for the hypocrisy. That's all they're doing. They're waiting for 100%. You to do the opposite of what you said you were going to do. You said you were going to be transparent, but you're not transparent. Yes. You said you were going to hold a high bar, except your bar for your team is different than the bar for my team. Like,
that's it's a big
all
one.
of those things that they're just reading and watching. And collecting all the data, and then the moment you do the opposite, they're like, "See, told you, not true. We don't have."
And when people come back to a leadership team and say that, like point out the hypocrisy, I usually see defensiveness. Right? Yeah. It's pretty rare that I see. Sometimes, you know what? You are totally right. Thank you for bringing that to me. We need to do better. Yeah, we need to do better, right? And I think instead, people feel attacked, but you know what? You should feel grateful that someone actually cares enough to tell you.
Exactly. But the response generally is, but you don't understand because this person does X, Y, and Z and nobody else does X, Y, and Z.
They're so important.
Right.
They're so important. And it's like, it just makes no sense. And the benefit would be,
the contrast, at least in my life, and I tend to use in teaching, is the difference between, and this is near and dear to my heart, and maybe it's gotten better, but at least as of 15 years ago, the difference between a superstar surgeon at the Cleveland Clinic and in the Stanford Hospital, and note I work for Stanford, and that a superstar surgeon at Stanford at least used to be, and probably still is, somebody who is just such a star that their team doesn't matter. All that matters is how famous they are on the outside and how many articles they publish. And at the Cleveland Clinic, a superstar surgeon is somebody who is great at supporting their team and being a good team player and not being a jerk. And at Stanford, we tend to reward the people who act like superstar jerks. And at the Cleveland Clinic, which doesn't have tenure, they fire them. And that's why I got heart surgery at the Cleveland Clinic rather than the Stanford Hospital 15 years ago.
Note to self.
And they also had they had half the risk-adjusted mortality rate at the Cleveland Clinic too. So back to Beth's numbers, and I heard this directly after I had surgery from Toby Cosgrove, who was head of the Cleveland Clinic for some 20 years, and not the nicest guy in the world, but he ran the heart surgeons before he became head of the Cleveland Clinic. And by the way, if you talk to people at the Stanford Hospital, which I do sometimes, the most profitable part of running a large hospital is heart surgery. So that's why the Cleveland Clinic has, as it was described to me recently, they make a whole bunch of money on heart surgery, they make a little money on cancer, and they lose money on everything else.
Oh, wow.
That's I don't know how accurate that was, but I keep repeating that and nobody's correcting me.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me. That's fascinating. Beth, what do you think, we have a lot of listeners who are founders. We have a lot of listeners that are leaders. We have a lot of listeners that are CHROs. What do you think are the things that companies should be focusing on right now in order to have effective cultures that move the business forward. It was interesting how you explained your role, because I always thought about my role as in a similar way, but I described it as I'm the chief effectiveness officer. My job is to make us incredibly effective. Where's the friction? Let's remove that. Where's the miscommunication? Totally. Let's get aligned. Where are the people that aren't performing? Get them out of here. Right? How do we become more effective? So what's your perspective?
Yeah, well, I think it's a lot of what you just said. I think, it's interesting. Right before this, I was having a coaching call with somebody, and they were telling me about, how their CEO has somebody who is really ineffective, but they don't really want to do anything because it's going to take too much time, and they have all this stuff going on. And I was like, absolutely not. What is your CEO saying to everybody else in the company to hang on to somebody who's not a great performer because of a relationship or loyalty or whatever? You were starting down a bad path here that's going to be hard to get out of. So, I really think there can be a lot of very different but effective cultures. So I think one thing is decide what you want to be. And it doesn't have to be, it can, I have in my head ideas of what makes a great culture. I may or may not be right. It may not be for everybody, but I think you have to really understand what you want to be. I think you have to memorialize those things. You have to entrench them into every single thing that you do. And then you need to hold people accountable, including yourselves, from the CEO on down, and make adjustments as you go. I think that is, how to run an effective company. And then I also think a leader, in my opinion, is just what you said. The job of a leader is to make people's work easier. And I think oftentimes, especially now, People are, because a lot of the middle layer of leadership has been decimated by a lot of the layoffs. And not arguably, I think for sure we had way too many layers of leadership, a lot of inefficiency in org structure, with people managing one person or two people. It just makes no friggin' sense at all. And I think we did it to over promote people in the day. But I think, if you are not asking yourself every day, how do I make the job of my people easier? And you're not asking people that question, you're not doing your job as a leader. And I think a lot of leaders don't do that, right? Part of it is, I think they're so caught up in politics, company politics. And, that is one thing I don't miss about being kind of a chief people officer anymore, is the politics. And, I can work 20 hours a day. I'm not even tired by it. I'm very energized by it. Politics is what exhausts me, right? Yeah. And so I think you've got to decide who you are. You have to reward the right things. You have to hold people accountable. I think there's such a lack of holding people accountable in companies that I see. It's just, it's bananas to me. Absolutely bananas.
So you just said so much, but I just want to underline one thing and then I'll turn it back. So you just said the job of a leader is to make people's work easier. Mm-hmm. Yes. And that, that's why Huggy Rao and I wrote a book called The Friction Project, but it's also, it's something that people just forget. So that's beautiful.
Do. Yeah. They do. Well, and you know what, Bob? Who's rewarded for that? And I think that's part of the problem is it's almost like you're a good leader out of the goodness of your heart, right? Because I don't know that companies understand, here are the components to actually get more work done. Hey, if I have a leader that's doing that, they're going to get, 10x bonus.
Right.
And versus a leader, which I've seen many a times, was terrible, knocked people over, their team hated them, and maybe they got lucky and got, something to work and they got a huge amount of equity or whatever, where the person who's like, my team's so effective, everybody's doing what they're supposed to do, our outcomes are amazing, whatever. And so I think companies have to really try to figure out what they're rewarding and why they're rewarding those things. And it's often not great leadership.
No, it's so true. And I think we did a better job at this than most companies. I mean,
I think so too.
I think so too.
Oh, thank you. But we really did hold leaders accountable. Like if you had a shitty team, then you were shitty. Right?
Yeah, see, and that's great.
That hired them all. Right?
Yeah,
like
no doubt.
So
all
you don't
roads
get to
lead
stay.
to you, man.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
All roads lead to you.
You don't get to stay,
Yeah.
and so it was the leader that we always looked at first. And I think a lot of companies look at teams first. And it's like,
they do.
Oh, look at them.
They do. I mean, right? I remember like saying to people, oh yeah, it's the L4 engineer's fault that this didn't happen. Yeah. Probably. Right? Probably. Like, come on, you guys. Like, get real. This is a leadership
the other
issue.
the other thing that happens in both bad and good companies, but especially bad companies, is they hire all the bad people, and then they go to you to fire them.
Yeah,
they don't do it themselves, right?
Oh, no. What was your new book going to be? Clean up on aisle.
Clean up on aisle 5.
Yes, clean up on aisle 5. So I have so many stories. Honestly, it's just. When I tell people some of my stories, they're like, that can't have happened. I'm like, it did happen. It did happen. It did happen.
I know. I'm sure you and I could share a many.
Oh, yes.
But they're probably not appropriate.
They're probably not, a lot of them are not appropriate. But I also would say, like, I'm sort of, dissing the chief people officer job. I also think and I've shared this with Bob, like, I am super proud of seeing so many of the leaders that worked under my teams who are now chief people officers, have huge teams of their own, have driven amazing outcomes, and people that I've coached and had a small hand in that. And I think, in this role, any leader, you really have the ability to help people be great. And that is a privilege. And you should take that very, very seriously, and you can change, people's lives. You can change outcomes by simply trying to do the right thing as a leader. And I think that is an awesome, amazing responsibility. I really do.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you said that, because I don't know if I originally felt this as a leader, but it was something that I just kind of became to my core, was that it was a privilege to be these people's leaders. And that, if I could somehow, one, make it easier for them to do their job, but leave things better than they were for them. You know what I mean? Like,
for sure.
Just incrementally,
Yes.
Whether that was giving them feedback, whether that was, getting an obstacle out of the way, it didn't matter. But I really took that seriously. And I think a lot of leaders might not take that as seriously.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. And they may not know. I mean, again, they may not know. And I think, when you talked about at Netflix, the leaders, kind of the buck stopping with the leaders. Why do you think that happened at Netflix? Was it Reed? Was it you and Patty kind of pushing Reed? Because I just don't see that enough.
I think it was Reed. I mean, and I if I think back, like I did learn it from him, and I think I might have said this on the podcast before, but I remember early on, like complaining to him about my team. And, I was like, my team and this, and they're not doing that, and blah, blah, blah. And he's like, whose fault that is? And I was like, yeah, theirs. And he's like, no, yours. It's your fault. He's like, 'cause you're the leader. So it's your fault. I was like, what? It's not my fault, Reed. But then, I went off and reflected on that. And we were, and I think he instilled in us, like, if your team is failing, then you have failed to set the context for them to be successful.
100%. Mm-hmm.
And so you have to look in the mirror first. And I have since then always done that.
Yeah.
And
that's
but
great.
I think that was just because he believed that was in our DNA.
So the other part, and you could know much more about this than I do, but at least from talking to Patty and from talking to actually a guy who was my advisee, I had an advisee at Stanford who also had a job at Netflix with 100 people reporting to him, named Eric Colson.
Oh yeah, we've talked.
So it's kind of weird. I have like an advisee as 100 employees reporting to him, and anyhow, so Patty and Eric told me a story about how Eric and other engineers, and Patty too, were complaining to Reed that it was too hard to end your Netflix subscription. And he actually just changed it and made it easy to cancel. And this is in the Friction Project, so I fact-checked it pretty heavily. And they said, they both argued that one of the reasons Netflix is so successful over the long term is it's so easy to quit your subscription. So they have really good data about sensitivity, and also people come back quickly because they know it's so easy to quit.
Yeah, no, it's true.
So, but I like that story because it shows to me that Reed was open to negative feedback, and people wanted to hear it. He wanted to hear it from people.
Yeah, it's great.
He was the best at this because he wanted us to be I think one of the things with him is that he viewed himself as a learner. Like he was like, I'm a lifelong learner. I want to learn. I want to get better. That was just who he was.
Curious.
And he also, very curious. He was also a teacher. Like he liked to teach, but he was the kind of person that when you gave feedback he asked for it all the time. Every meeting, do you have feedback for me? Right. Wow. And then you'd be like, I don't know. Sure. And then he would obviously give you feedback, which is like great. But if he agreed with it, which he didn't agree with it every time, sometimes it would take him a little bit of time to get around to, he changed immediately. Like and especially on the big things that we said that we were going to do, like as from a behavior perspective, like, okay, we're no longer doing this. We're doing this, right? He would be the first one to walk out of the room and do it. And he would just do it.
That's great. That's great.
And because he did it, guess what? Everybody else did it. Yeah. And it made my job so much easier because if I was telling people to do it, they'd be like, pound sand, Jessica. That sounds great.
Right.
Like,
well, and I think
about your HR thingies.
I think what happens is, if people feel punished for questioning or punished for giving feedback, obviously they're going to stop doing that. And I think, it's hard to take feedback. It is hard to, to change, but like, that's what makes leaders good, right? You have to adapt over time. You have to be introspective. You have to be able to look in the mirror. Those things are not easy. And that's why I think, leadership is not for everyone. And I think, I was talking earlier to somebody about this today. We have to be able to have dual tracks inside companies where you can make a lot of money, be important, viewed as important without being a leader, because we sort of set up these perverse incentives for promotion and for leadership, and we mess ourselves up by doing that. It is okay not to want to be a leader. You should be able to make a lot of money. You should be able to be important, whatever that means to you, without, kind of tricking people into being a leader when it's like they didn't even want to do it anyway.
No, but I'm so glad you said that, because I was just talking to a company about that the other day, and it's like they have these really great, like, product people, engineering people who deserve a seat at the table in the meeting in the room that the directors are in, and they're operating at that level. But they're like, but they can't come in that room because they don't have any reports.
It's ridiculous.
Like, is that who gets in the room? That's how we're making don't you want the people that are going to influence you to make the best decision possible in the room, regardless of whether they have, I do think you're right. I mean, we sort of have created this, perverse is the right word. Like, way of promoting people who don't have any desire to be a leader, will never be a good leader, but they do it because that's the only way to get more money and to get ahead.
Get in the room.
And I'm like, yeah. And they're like, but I would talk to these people like, well, they're just not great at leadership. Then don't make them a leader.
Don't make them be. Exactly. Well, and I think, totally. A couple of things. Like what we had a situation at Chime where we had this super talented person who, we made sort of an architect leader. And luckily he had the courage to go to somebody on my team and be like, I hate being a friggin' leader. Like, I love this company. I want to do good work. And so what we did is we made him a fellow. And so we made him like equivalent to a vice president so he could still make a lot of money. He got a seat in the room. So when we had like extended leadership team meetings, he got to sit in that room. And it was a really wise decision because it served everybody's interests in a really, really productive way. The other thing about that too, I think it's such a smart thing to do. The other thing too is, talk about, there's companies get so bloated and, there's been a lot of layoffs of middle managers this year. And I think a lot of mistakes that companies have made is, over, promoting people or getting people into leadership as a way to give them, growth, career growth. But then you're left with an organization that has a bunch of people that only have 2 or 3 direct reports. You're in a 500 person company and you're 7 layers from the CEO, and you wonder why you don't have product velocity. Well, I'll tell you why. Like, it's impossible to get anything done, right? And so we have to stop equating big teams with good.
So I love this notion that just by creating perverse incentives for leaders and for leadership, that you end up with bloated organizations that can't get things done. And I will name names since you won't. You're both more polite than I am. But both Google and Stanford have a perverse incentive system, and they're both trying to work on it, where the more people who report to you independently of the value you provide, the more you get paid.
That's right.
And the problem with that, and note Stanford did layoffs last week, hopefully laid off some of the right people. And the problem with that is that you not only are overpaying and overhiring people, you end up with, as Beth said so beautifully, you end up with a system where it's actually harder and harder to get things done because there's too many people who block it because they get paid to block it.
Yeah,
that's right.
So
exactly. That's right. Exactly.
That's right.
I don't know.
Yeah, but I think actually for people in talent space, this is actually a great problem that they can help to solve. Like if you help set up organizational structures in the right way early and hold to those things, which is really interesting work, you can avoid doing that kind of thing. And, I have a model. It's not my model, but it's, culture, structure, talent, management systems, and process. And that's how I think about scale. Most companies never think about structure and the impact that structure has a huge impact on outcomes. Huge.
So the company I think of that does that well, it's funny, we're just talking about them before we went on air, and there's lots to criticize about them, but Walmart has a real clear perspective about structure and also about not overhiring.
Yeah.
Because they talk about lean and there's plenty to criticize about Walmart, but in terms of an organization that understands velocity and not having excessive people, I think that might be one of the keys to their success.
Yeah, I think so too. I think that they're very, the other thing I think that they do very well is that they're grounded very much in their values, right? Like,
agree. I was going to say they're sort of unapologetic about how they run, right?
Yeah. And that's probably because they live their values. That's a result of living the values, right? is that they're scrappy and they stay lean.
On that.
Okay, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry. Donna Morris, who's the chief people officer, or whatever she's called, she interviewed me at Bentonville about a year ago, and she asked me, like, what do you think about Walmart? And I say, well, you're clear about your values. You're cheap and nice. And Amazon's clear about their values too. They're cheap and nasty. Yeah. But they're clear.
Yeah, they are.
Totally. It doesn't, I agree with that. It doesn't, there are many, many ways to run your company. Many ways that work.
I think, and you said this earlier, and this is something that I coach every CEO on. It doesn't matter. You have to be clear.
Agreed.
That's Agreed. All. As long as you're clear.
And consistent and not a hypocrite, right?
Right, and not a hypocrite. Mm-hmm. But I do think, Beth, if you chief people officers are listening, you can do this. And I see us often on things like just like structure and design, copying and pasting what other companies do.
Totally.
And there is a push from the organization, especially managers who are desperate to give their people promotions, to, give them growth. But
that's right.
You have a responsibility to the organization to make it more effective, right? And I guess my wish for them is to resist that push, right?
I agree.
And to focus on what's ultimately going to make the organization be more effective in a year, 2 years from now. And if adding layers, you think will do that, go right ahead. But generally adding layers does not.
Well,
and it's like,
it isn't.
To an organization, it's like, well, the senior and the senior. And I'm like, how?
Oh, I know. And I actually think that we don't take enough time to ask people, like, why do you want to be a leader? Like, what is important to you? Because I think most people, they want to make money, they want to make enough money. For sure. So you kind of take that off the table if you have a good compensation system. They want to actually learn and grow and get better. It's sort of like the Daniel Pink autonomy, mastery, purpose. But so I challenge people all the time. You need to think about your career more like a checkerboard than a ladder, right? Mm-hmm. What are the critical experiences that you can have that are going to make you better in service of maybe, that end outcome that you want? And don't get it in your head that there's just, you go from this to this to this to this to this. Maybe you go from, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, if you look at people's careers, that's not how it's happening anyway.
It's not exactly.
It's not that's right. It's like I went over here and I did this and I learned that and then
that's
I did that. But
that's right.
But it's such a great point. And every time I'm talking to a CHRO and they're like, okay, we're getting all this push from everybody that they want development, they want a ladder, so we're going to create leveling and we're going to do. And I'm like, but that's not what they want. That's how they're describing it. But if you really get to it, they want to grow. They want to know that they have an impact. They have leaders that don't know how to tell them these things.
That's right.
They don't know how to talk to them about development. They don't know how to talk to them about the impact that they're having. And so they want you to put a process in place that makes them feel good. But that's not solving any problems.
It isn't. And I think a lot of companies right now, because they don't invest in their leaders, because they don't really hold people accountable to leadership, they do management by process. They think, if you have a strict enough process, you're going to drive performance, or you're just not. It ultimately is going to fail if you don't have the humans behind, doing those things. And it is a lazy way out.
Yes. Thank you.
Yes.
Ah, my God. We are out of time. My gosh.
Oh my goodness.
We don't even have time for a career confession.
Oh my goodness. I was so looking forward to that.
Well, do you want to try to do it quick?
Sure.
Let's do it quick.
Okay, let's do it quick. All right.
I'll talk very fast.
Well, yeah. You're a good fast talker like me. I like that. Okay, here we go. Here's the context. I want to support my team's growth, but between deadlines and constant changes, I end up giving quick fixes instead of real coaching for long-lasting change. So the question is, what's one practical way to build my team's skills without slowing down our day-to-day work and balancing the short and long run at the same time?
Yeah, that's a great question. I am of the 70-20-10 school, 70 by learning by doing, 20 by coaching and mentoring, and 10 by formal learning practices. So I would say you could do something where you have people either shadow others in a job for a short period of time, or maybe have a team meeting where you have people doing different things, talking through not only what they did, but why they did it, and take questions, something like that. It would take a little bit of time, but it would also be a way to bring people closer together. I would also say examine your calendar and maybe try to figure out what you can take yourself out of. Maybe you could put one of your team members in as your proxy, if it's appropriate for something, and that's a great learning opportunity too.
Yeah, no, that's a perfect answer. Great. Bob, anything?
I just love that. It just sort of reminds me. I was just talking to the CHRO of a pharmaceutical company yesterday, and she said, so we have a pretty strong norm, no matter how busy you are, whether you're in management or you're developing the vaccines and stuff they develop, that you really should spend an hour a month talking to actual customers, actual people who are using our products.
Right.
And these are products for treatment for cancer and things like that. And I think that's a good use of an hour a month to get people, well, that gets them to purpose, if nothing else, Beth.
Right. Yes, for sure. And sure. I think honestly, at the end of the day, a leader, like people want to do great things. Your job is to let them. Your job is just to let them do that, right? So you can don't overcomplicate things.
Yeah, and be okay if they do it differently than you.
Exactly.
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 Beth, this was so fun.
Thank you, Beth.
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, Bob. It's been a great pleasure.
Well, any excuse to talk to you, Beth, whether it's one-on-one or
I know
video.
we need to do something else together, Bob, for sure.
We'll figure it out.
Okay.
All right, and me and you are now connected forever.
I know.
Yes.
Don't regret that decision, Jessica.
No, I'm not.